Hello, welcome back to another edition of Tips and Tricks. Today we're going to look at Ridgewalk, which is one of my older plugins, but I think still has some corners to it that aren't fully explored. So I want to show you just this simple melody that I wrote on the Juno, and this is what we're going to be working with. Pretty simple melody, and we're going to use Ridgewalk to add some kind of time stretching effects to it. So, if you don't already know, Ridgewalk is it's kind of a looper and a granular effect in one. It records audio to a singular buffer, just like a sound-on-sound looper, but then there's a granular engine that kind of plays back from that engine, kind of in a micro looper style. So, just dropped Ridgewalk onto this channel, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set Ridgewalk into auto recording mode, which is the default, so it'll start recording when it receives signal. But I'm going to change the buffer size here. So, we go back to this melody that I had written, we can see that it is 4 bars long. So I want to capture all of that. So I'm going to bump up the buffer size to 4 bars. And then I'm actually going to turn off feedback as well. So every time we record, it'll just record the same thing over again. So there's not going to be any overdubbing. So we've got a buffer that's set to 4 bars. And what I want to point out today is kind of how the buffer size will interact with the traversal speed. So the buffer size is how much content is recorded, and the traversal speed also moves through that audio recording at a certain pace. So by default, our granular engine kind of scans through our buffer from forward to backward, and it does that over the course of 4 bars by default. So, if we record 4 bars of content and then kind of scan through it with our granular engine over the course of 4 bars, it's going to more or less sound a lot like the input. So, I am going to turn our wet all the way down. We're going to record into Ridgewalk, and then we're just going to listen to the output. All right, so now we've got that recorded. Let's pause Ridgewalk and turn the wet up, and let's just hear how it sounds. So it kind of sounds like the original, but because we're using a granular engine, it gets a little jumbled. There's certain things we can do to kind of prevent this. For one, when I'm doing something like this, I usually like to turn down the number of micro loops that are going on. So we can turn that down just to 1. And I also like to turn off the drift, which kind of adds like a random jitter to the position of the micro loops and their size. So it's usually a little better to just have that more consistent. Maybe we'll turn the size down a little bit of the micro loops as well. Let's hear that. Cool, so now we're getting something that's pretty close to the original. But it's a little boring just to use a granular algorithm to kind of just mirror the original input. But I wanted to play that as a proof of concept. But the other thing I want to point out is, what if we start to change the relationship between the traversal speed and the buffer size. Right now they're the same. What if we drop the traversal speed down to 2 bars? We're still playing through the buffer, but now we're kind of blowing through it twice as fast. And let's hear what the result is. So now we've got this like double time version of the input. And if we really want to kind of synchronize this, we can actually set the micro loopers to have a quantized time or quantized size. So let's drop that down to like 16th notes. So now we're really going to be firing on every beat. Nice. We can also take this in the opposite direction. What if we doubled the traversal speed with respect to the buffer size? If we made it 8 bars, now we're going to play through this buffer in like slow motion. And you might actually kind of recognize that sound because a lot of time stretching algorithms, like you'll find in Ableton or other software, they actually work in this granular way. They are essentially playing back little snippets from the buffer and overlapping them a little bit. And they're just kind of using that as a technique to speed up or slow down the audio. Now, you know, the Ableton algorithms are a little bit more sophisticated than that. They do a lot of transient analysis and stuff like that. But one thing that Ridgewalk offers, which I think is pretty cool, is it can do this as a live effect. So let's just start from scratch. And I'm going to speed up the traversal speed to 2 bars. And you can hear that we can actually perform this double time effect while we are actually recording audio. So that's kind of fun for like instant counterpoint. You might have noticed that it took until we actually recorded a full buffer for that effect to kind of sound coherent. So one of the ways you could kind of ensure that it's going to kind of be in sync would be to turn off the instant playback option. So you can see with instant playback, the playback will immediately start kind of as soon as we can, even if we don't have a full buffer. So when this is enabled, it can actually kind of mess up this effect. So you could turn that off and then it'll be a little bit more coherent. You might notice that this melody actually changes halfway through the buffer. It kind of has a very slight A and B version. So we could actually just make our buffer 2 bars. And then we'll kind of record one version of the melody and the other version like back and forth. So in that case, we'd want to drop the traversal down to 1 bar. So that gets a little chaotic. So sometimes what I like to do is kind of differentiate the output, the wet output of Ridgewalk from the dry output of what's coming in. One of the ways we can do that is by changing the pitch. We can make Ridgewalk output up an octave, and then that's going to add this kind of like shimmery octave up version in double time, which is kind of cool. But this isn't actually anything special, because when you play audio back twice as fast, it is usually up an octave. But what Ridgewalk lets you do is we could actually slow down our playback and pitch it up an octave at the same time. So we could have this like octave up shimmer effect in slow motion. And another way we could differentiate this would be by adding blur. Beyond 50%, blur starts to add a reverb. So we could really verb this out, maybe dial in like a dry wet balance that's a bit nicer. Let's hear the output of that. Actually, I'm going to bump up the size of these micro loops too. Let's make them 1/8 notes. So I really like this effect because we're playing with this relationship between time, pitch, and now we're kind of able to craft these complementary kind of soundscapes and melodic counterpoint all from the source material. If you kind of dial in this effect with Ridgewalk, I could go back here and completely change this melody. I could go to a B section. I could start improvising on the keys or send it a different sound, whatever. And this effect will be maintained. We're always going to kind of get this slow motion octave up effect, which just kind of, in my opinion, can instantly add like richness and depth to your production. So I think this is really fun. Just to kind of think about this relationship between the buffer size and the traversal speed. And the last thing I want to point out is we can also, we could reverse all of this. We don't just have to play from backward to forward. We could also kind of play that melody in reverse and abstract it even further. So I think that sounds really nice. This is the kind of thing that you could throw on a send channel, and maybe just kind of send a percentage of, all of your melodic elements to, or your chord progression, your melody, your background, vocals, whatever. I just think it's an effect that can really immediately add just this layer of atmosphere and depth to whatever you're doing. I think it's fun to even process this further. Like, you could send the output of Ridgewalk to like a really big, long reverb, just really smooth this whole output. You could send it to another granular effect, which kind of adds random octaves or panning or whatever. So I think there's just a lot of really interesting and flexible ways you can work with this effect. And I would encourage you also to think about the different movement patterns as well. We're just looking at forward because I think it's kind of the natural default. But we can also think about something like the ping pong effect, which can play from forward to backward, back and forth. And we can think about how that melody gets reinterpreted as it kind of plays through one way and then gets reimagined in the reverse. And there's even this external option, which lets you follow just an automation control. So in Ridgewalk, there is this control called external motion. And so if you set traversal to external, it'll just follow that, which is really fun. I can just demonstrate that really quick. So you could use that basically to dial in whatever curve you want. Maybe an exponential kind of thing, or a sine wave LFO as opposed to traversal, which is more of a linear style motion. I think there's a lot of cool options here. But at the heart of it all, I think it's really interesting to think about the relationship between the buffer size and the traversal speed, especially when it comes to being, doubled or halved. So I would try that out next time you load Ridgewalk up. See if you get some cool results.